Okay, so wonderful to be here with you in this EU-ASEAN group. We, I think, stand for an established network between Europe and Asia, and it has always been a pleasure to work with the colleagues from Chulalongkorn University. When Sutipan Shirativat this morning said in Asia it's not always clear how to understand Brexit, I think for Europeans it's also not a very different and better situation. Okay, so I just want to take a brief look at Trump's trade policy, Brexit, and declining multilateralism. I would like to go through some of the slides. You have a paper outside which you can pick up. So we just have published here in the International Economics and Economic Policy Journal a special issue on Brexit, which basically summarizes the results from a Bundesbank-sponsored project on Brexit-related capital market aspects. And I'm sure that there is still need for further research. And actually, it's a particular situation, as you might all have noted, that some of our colleagues who are very knowledgeable about capital market aspects are kind of silent these days. Central bankers are not publishing. Since about 18 months, Bank of England, Deutsche Bundesbank, ECB, I mean, they all have their internal papers and discussions. So we are filling a gap. But it's also a true challenge for scientists because policy-making processes are complicated these days. Okay, so I have several of these key points, of course, asking to which extent economic globalization can be sustained, and of course, the EU-ASEAN relations cannot be analyzed without taking a look at Washington, D.C. these days. So with Trump's trade policy, which is very difficult from what the U.S. policy used to be, and also the United States, it seems, is no longer supporting EU economic integration, and that's a big historical and economic and political change. So Trumpism, of course, is anti-multilateralism, so that basically means a declining role of international organizations. And these international organizations, I think, have contributed quite a bit to cooperation, to prosperity, stability in the past decades. It's unclear in which direction in the long term the international system is moving. Now with Brexit, I would say there are two clear winners. One is Mr. Putin, and the other is the 19th century, in the sense that, of course, there is some risk that we will move back to a grand powers regime, certainly with different leader countries, so in this case the US and China. Everything, what is happening these days is to some extent influenced, of course, by digital expansion, and the role of China, I think, is well understood in the business community and in part of the political system, but it's not so easy, for instance, for a European public or for the US public to understand how dramatic this new role of China is. And then we have one common challenge, which is climate policy. But that, again, is not something where we easily find consensus. All what we know for the moment is that Brexit has not taken place on March 29, so that's one fact which is clear. It's based on this year 2016 with this historical referendum, which surprisingly, at least for many observers, was then 51.9% for Brexit. Donald Trump already in his campaign, in his presidential campaign, had expressed sympathy for Brexit, and he was arguing there will be more like this. When he came to power, what he did then, he adopted a new economic policy, including tax reforms, and then this new trade policy, and the Sino-US conflicts, I'm afraid, will affect both ASEAN and the EU in a negative way. And even if there would be an agreement, if China has to deliver by 2025 certain progress elements, that means, in my view, that we are heading toward a medium-term period of at least political tensions. The whole system so far, the international system in economic relations, has relied much on the World Trade Organization, but at the end of this year, it is dead in the sense that the conflict resolution, the dispute settlement mechanism will no longer work, as the US is blocking the election of judges, which is necessary. So question is about this referendum. I have expressed in this book, An Accidental Brexit, some doubts to which extent this was an orderly referendum, in the sense that certain information standards, minimum standards were met. So when you compare the Scottish referendum, I would say people were well informed, while for some reasons the Cameron info brochure in 2016 did not give the information from the Treasury study that people would lose roughly 10% of their income if there would be Brexit. And based on a popularity function, one can calculate what would have been the what would have been the hypothetical result if people had been fully informed about the findings available to the government, and then there would have been a majority for the EU. So the dynamics are really considerable, in the sense we have so many changes at the same time. So the UK, we have China's economic rise, and it has actually accelerated since 2000. Maybe it is now facing a period of slowdown, which might also not be easy to digest for China. And the Sino-Asian conflicts, in any case, are a big challenge. So some of the ASEAN countries, just to compare, ASEAN and the EU, have caught up with EU countries. So here you have a graph which shows the per capita income of EU countries, and in red then you have Singapore. Okay, the next country, Brunei, is an exception because it has so much oil, but we have Malaysia and then also Thailand and others. So Thailand very soon will overtake per capita income of Bulgaria and Romania, and that means there will be more opportunities for trade, of course. So Brexit dynamics, I think, weaken the traditional Western system. President Trump has always these complaints about the US trade balance deficit. Are these problems to be solved, or are they getting worse? And as you can see from the trade balance deficit figures from last year, they have actually worsened, and that will make the US maybe more aggressive. Germany is one of the countries in the EU facing challenges from the US, as certainly President Trump is not just looking at the trade deficit vis-à-vis China, but also at Germany, and Germany is one of these big surplus countries. In the paper, I basically argue that this emphasis on merchandise trade balance is inappropriate. It's 4.2% of US GDP, while the current account imbalance, close to 2%, is much smaller. So the situation in the US is actually not so bad. What is a strange situation in Washington, and I think this should cause some concern, is that the Trump administration has not been able to replace the political appointees of the Obama administration. So less than 3/4 of the about 4,000 experts were replaced. And to some extent, this means that, for instance, in Treasury or in the Department of Commerce, there are about 80 experts missing, and one of my IMF colleagues said there's no problem as long as the international economy is characterized by fair weather, but once we have a storm, then we would not know to whom we should talk at the Treasury. And I think part of the sometimes poor quality of the Trump administration can be explained by a lack of expertise. I find it also really strange that some of the scientific background of the US administration has become much more ideological than in previous administrations. So there's a paper by the Council of Economic Advisors published in 2018 about the opportunity cost of socialism, and then they argue how bad Venezuela was, and of course Cuba. And when they talk about socialism, they also look at Nordic European countries, which somehow seem to come under this heading as well. And basically they argue that the US has a big lead in terms of per capita income, or in this case of per capita consumption. And I'm also looking at these figures, and I find many of these figures are really simply wrong, in the sense that, for instance, the Council of Economic Advisors takes only a look at 2016 and then the per capita consumption at PPP figures. If, on the other hand, you take a look at lifetime, at expected lifetime per capita consumption, you get different figures. First, because the Europeans have life expectancy 3 to 4 years longer. We actually also have a lower infant mortality. And of course, you have to take into account, and therefore I talk about effective per capita consumption or income. You have to take into account that the Europeans work much less than the Americans. So if you translate your additional leisure bonus into something like income equivalent or consumption equivalent, then my findings are basically that the European leading countries and the US are on par. So here you have the table from the Council of Economic Advisors. For instance, they would say Norway is the best positioned Nordic country which is 18% below the US per capita consumption level. And when I make these calculations and correct for the differences in healthcare expenditures, do not forget Americans spend 17% of their GDP on healthcare, France and Germany 11%. The longer life expectancy is, however, in Europe. So if I take a look here, for instance, in the forthcoming book, which is entitled The Global Trump, at lifetime consumption, then France, Germany, and the US are virtually at the same level. Okay, so we have a lot of discussions then. Why is Trump? Why do we see this populism? And I basically have argued this has something to do with the rising income inequality. Initially, I was not so convinced about this, although you might also know the figures from the Piketty Research Group. So here you have the top 10 national income shares. It has particularly increased in the US, but also in China. And on the other hand, what is really shocking to some extent is how much the percentage of the lower 50% of US income earners, so the lower part of the income pyramid, how much this has declined between 1980 and 2016, so roughly from 21 to 13%. And the top income earners, the top 1%, has very strongly increased. And that itself would not be, I think, such a big challenge, but I was participating at a UN conference and I learned from American sociologists that the relative majority of people surveyed in the US think that this problem should be remedied by multinational US companies. I mean, this is science fiction. This is as good a science fiction story as Brexiteers would say. From Brexit, we all can increase our income. And I think this is a serious problem. So in Europe, just for comparison, as you can see, the developments are much less dramatic, and still Mr. Macron has a lot of problems. But on the other hand, Macron has problems because he did not follow the good political model of Sweden. Sweden has a CO2 tax, and they would use part of the revenues to compensate the lower income strata, and then they were able to proceed with a very successful CO2 tax system, which has reduced CO2 emissions by 25% between last year and 1990. So we in Europe, if we would do our homework and do the political benchmarking as we are supposed to do, that would be very useful. One of the key findings from OECD research is that the rising Chinese exports bring an increase of wage polarization both in the US and in Europe. And that is a challenge again for the political system. The trade policy of the US, I must say, is very difficult to understand. So when Trump introduced the import tariff on aluminum and steel, it was said this is because of security reasons, but it's very difficult to understand this political logic when most of steel and aluminum come from your NATO partner colleagues. So as regards this long-term changes, here everybody can see that the GDP of China has increased so much, so now it's higher than in the US and in the EU 28. And I think the institutions so far have not really adjusted to this new challenge. And sometimes it's also not so easy to say how we should do this, because let's say if you talk about fighting an international recession, where would you do this? You would do this in the OECD, but China, of course, is not an OECD member country. Okay, it's part of this outreach program in the OECD Development Center. Here we have ASEAN and the increase of ASEAN over time. So ASEAN and China were not so far apart in the year 2000. China then was 1.5 times the ASEAN GDP. More recently, it's 3 times as big. But it could be that indeed the China growth is slowing down in the context of this US-Sino trade conflict, and ASEAN could increase. So we will see which international spillover effects this Sino-US trade conflict has. It certainly, I think, will bring more foreign direct investment of China to ASEAN, because many Chinese firms think that once they would export to the US out of Asian countries, they would be not in the focus of the US trade policy agenda. How convincing is it that an aggressive US trade policy brings benefits? So there's a paper by the US International Trade Office from Kim and Schicker basically showing that in the short term there are some benefits, in the long term there are only losses for the US. So why Trump still is pursuing this approach, I can only assume that maybe an explanation is that he is a businessman not from the tradable sector, but from the non-tradable sector. He's from the construction industry, and he does not have good knowledge about this sector, which not necessarily is a problem, but his advisors are mainly advisors from the team, to some extent at least. Important people are from the Reagan team, and they behave as if China would be something like Japan. But Japan is much bigger, and things are different. Okay, a few words on Brexit. So Brexit, I think, is a big challenge. It's not so easy to understand how this all came about. So Cameron basically had this intra-party problem with anti-EU factions, and of course with UKIP. And I already said that I have some doubts about this referendum procedure. I think the British should vote for whatever they want, but we want to have a, let's say, an adequate referendum procedure. We will see what the result in the end will be. I think it will be really messy. It will be not a very well-organized situation. And on the other hand, I think Brexit really stands for a populist project, which is difficult in some cases, or in some fields to understand again, because when, for instance, there was this famous bus, and Boris Johnson in the campaign was emphasizing, that we can then post-Brexit use 350 million EU contributions for the national health system. I mean, everybody understands that this figure is wrong, because these were gross figures, and every British government would replace the current spending from Brussels for British universities, poor regions, and certain firms from the national government. So you can use only the net payments, which is less than 1/2. And finally, when Boris Johnson, then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, repeated everything in an op-ed, then the head of UK Statistics Office, Sir David Norgrove, wrote in a letter that, of course, this is not correct. This confuses gross and net contributions, and this is all a misuse of official statistics. So how can this happen that in one of the leading Western economies you have so much confusion? Is very difficult to understand. Okay, a few words on globalization, because that is at risk if multilateralism comes, or if multilateralism is weakened both from the US and indirectly also through this Brexit, because in a certain way you might argue that Brexit is an exercise in protectionism. I mean, it's a self-selected protectionism in the sense that the Brexiteers knew that, okay, if they leave the European Union after 46 years, then they will face most likely EU import tariffs, and if it is not for goods, then in any case for the services side it will be more difficult. The one passport will no longer be valid, and so on. Okay, just what some, I think, influential IMF paper of Jomot et al. Showed already several years ago. So the basic dynamics of globalization is that we see that there is trade in the way it should work. That means the trade expansion is reducing the economic per capita differences across countries. But on the other hand, we have a situation that we have financial globalization, which of course is not in favor of everybody. Financial globalization is good if you have collateral or if you are a skilled worker, so you have high income and you can benefit from lower real interest rates, which are a consequence of financial globalization. And to the extent that there is this ongoing digitization, which of course is also very strong in Asia, again, it's the skilled workers who benefit, so that you get economic convergence across countries, but in every country, more or less, you get an increasing economic divergence between the skilled workers' wages and the unskilled workers' wages. That's a big problem. Of course, one can cope with this. The question is, what is the best way to do? And I would argue that the social market economy in Germany and Europe offers still many interesting approaches. Of course, we have a different competition among economic systems these days, and it's interesting what is the best system you can have. And in this whole debate, of course, Asia has to be integrated, and Asia with 60% of the world population will be decisive here. Just one last thought. If the decline of multilateralism would weaken globalization strongly, then, according to what I have said, the North-South economic divergence would be rising, because one can show empirically that economic globalization helps poor countries to catch up. Now, if you would disturb this economic globalization to work, that means then, for instance, that African countries, or maybe poor Latin American countries, they would see that their economic growth rates are declining, and that would mean you get increasing emigration pressure to the north, And this is then, of course, a driver of more populism in Europe and maybe the US and elsewhere. So I think it is very important that the European Union, that the EU countries, the ASEAN countries should cooperate in a way that they defend multilateralism and globalization, of course, with rules, with better rules, for instance, for the digital world economy, because in a large part of the digital economy, which is growing year by year, we have no rules. And this is a serious challenge, since even the European Union simply is too small to create rules for the digital economy. That it is very difficult to bring the US, China, ASEAN, the EU and Japan at a table and to find out, okay, what should be the rules of the game for digital globalization in the 21st century. That's also obvious. But this is really some of the challenges where we need more cooperation, where there is a lack, I find, of international workshops between ASEAN and the EU, where not everything obviously is left to the United States, and where it is probably also not very useful if countries do things just by themselves, as France has introduced this digital tax, or probably also Austria. So I will stop here and just summarize that I think we are living in a more complex and dynamic world economy. The Brexit is a big challenge for the UK and the EU. Clearly the EU is weakened. We are losing 1/5 of our economic weight. And on the other hand, that will also be a big problem for the UK, because if the UK really would be not in a customs union, would want to have its own trade policy, I mean, they are so much weaker with 1/5 of the old weight via the EU 28. But Mr. Gavin Williamson, the Defense Secretary, already has indicated, I think, a way he thinks it should work. He was saying, and he was pointing out to Brexit, and he was pointing out to the global role of the UK, and he was proudly mentioning this idea that HMS Queen Elizabeth on its maiden voyage would not just travel to the Mediterranean, but also to the Pacific. And for me, that sounds like kind of 19th century approach. Okay, you will offer more military protection, and this brings you in a position that other countries give you better conditions than for your free trade agreement. So that's, I would say, new risks, and we will see, I think, also in this conference how this will work out. Many thanks.